I'm Tammy Dunnett, ex-Target workplace bully turned communication coach. But it wasn't that long ago when I lacked the skills, the tools, and the knowledge to ditch the drama, confidently handle difficult conversations, and create better relationships. Fast forward past many failed attempts and lessons learned, and you will see the business that I have today. One that is helping others just like you to find the confidence and peace knowing you can change your circumstances one conversation at a time. I created the Dissolve Workplace Conflict Summit to give you access to industry leaders who are sharing simple, actionable, step-by-step strategies so you can do the same. If you are an employee, supervisor, or an employer and you are looking to access the top strategies to successfully dissolve conflict without damaging your relationships, then you, my friend, are in the right place. Today, I want to introduce you to Catherine Mattice. She is the founder and CEO of Civility Partners, an HR consulting firm focused on helping organizations create respectful workplace cultures. Her clients range from Fortune 500s to small businesses in a huge array of industries. Catherine is an HR thought leader, and she has appeared in such venues as USA Today, Bloomberg, CNN, NPR, and many other national news outlets as an expert. She's also an award-winning speaker, author, and blogger, and a LinkedIn Learning course author. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about how partnering with HR to create a workplace where you feel safe is such a valuable tool. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm excited to have you here today too. Actually, just having the HR perspective in this discussion, I think is so important. When I think of my own experience and others that I've helped with, there seems to be some misrepresentation or misperception about what HR's role is and how they can help us out.
Yeah, for sure.
So why don't we start out just by really getting into the weeds here quickly, and what is the difference between workplace bullying and harassment?
Well, the first answer is nothing. The behaviors are the same. The law, however, says that it depends on who you aim that behavior at. So if you bully everyone, that behavior is perfectly legal. If you bully protected characteristic or a group of people or one person because of their protected characteristic, then the law calls that harassment. But I'll go past that. So I say that because I think, especially in the world of HR, we get really caught up on what the technicalities are of things, which I understand that's part of HR's role, but it's also not all that useful if HR is really trying to pick through things. So a better answer is that bullying is ongoing, repeated, pervasive abuse at work. And it almost always includes three buckets of behavior: aggressive communication, humiliation, and manipulation. So I rarely, if ever, have seen somebody be called a bully if they weren't engaging in all three of those. So you got somebody who yells, but other than that, they're fine. We're not usually calling that person a bully versus if they're engaging in these three buckets.
That's an interesting distinction, because I think a lot of times the word bully is utilized to express that there's a behavior in the workplace that's uncomfortable, but really getting into those definitions and understanding what a true bully behavior is and is not can be quite complicated.
Yeah, for sure. But in the end, NHR asks me this all the time. Well, people throw out things like abusive conduct or a hostile work environment. Those are legal terms. And so HR can tend to get caught up in, well, let's do an investigation. Technically, it's not that, and I was telling, look, if they're using words like that, it feels that way to them, whether or not the law defines it that way. If someone says, I feel abused, you have to deal with it.
And I think that's another important piece to make. So when I hear the word bully, I don't automatically assume that, yes, whoever they're talking about truly is a bully. But what I hear with them when they share that with me is that they're feeling like their capacity to deal with it has been overrun and they don't know what to do next. So this is the safest place to go, is they're the bad person and I don't know what to do. Has that been your has that been your experience?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yes, I think people also, it's just a matter of trying to make sense of it, right? If you're targeted at work, it's confusing. You feel lonely. People at home maybe don't fully understand why you're so traumatized by it. You're really in this kind of a flag waving in the wind. So I agree with you in the interest of helping our brains kind of figure out what's happening. the easiest way to do that is to say, well, they're bullying and I'm targeted. And that's a simple explanation for how I feel. So yeah, I agree with that.
It's kind of like a universal label people just are using a lot now, and it's become quite a buzzword in one sense, but a real cautionary word at the other, because it can be quite career limiting.
Yeah, for sure. For both a target and someone who's engaging in bullying. So, targets feel very trapped, and they feel that their world is coming down around them, and their productivity and ability to deliver quality work with a smile and to thrive is all being torn apart. And then people engaging in bullying, when I'm brought on to coach those people, often they've been allowed to bully for a while. Finally, they've crossed some sort of line, or the CEO got smacked in the face in some way, shape, or form, whether through a lawsuit or a public declaration on Glassdoor or whatever it was. And now that person's finally being told, if you continue to act that way, there's a consequence for you. So it's good for nobody, of course.
Yeah. Do you find that when you do get called in to work with someone who's been put in that category, that they truly are, a bully, or is this someone who's got good intentions with bad expectations or bad communication skills? Is there a difference maybe?
Yes, there is. I think we have to look at bullying behaviors on a spectrum in some way. So, um, there's out there in the world on the internet, there's all sorts of commentary about how they're a psychopath. And certainly if you're targeted, it certainly feels on purpose and intentional, and that this person wakes up in the morning excited about the fact that they're going to make you cry, and it's like all very intentional.
Yeah.
I do not find that. There's definitely people who are psychopaths and that's their deal. That's the exception though, not the rule. When I get called in to coach, what's happening is the individual is so focused on success and competence and even success for the team and the organization that they live in this hyper fear of incompetence. And we all want to be seen as competent, but they're living in a highly anxious kind of feeling around that all the time. And I kind of joke, they're my delicate flowers, or they're like glass, they shatter easily. And so they shatter, and that's when the bullying comes out. Just to give you a couple of examples of that, one individual I coached actually caused a panic attack in someone else who had a physical reaction to being yelled at, because he'd been getting yelled at for years and being manipulated and all this stuff. This employee finally just had a physical reaction. Well, this individual that I coached was the CTO of a Fortune 5000 company. He was employee number 8 at this organization. They now had around 5,000 employees. And the guy I coached, his job was to create and execute different types of software that gets sold off for millions of dollars to the Googles and the Microsofts of the world. So he was carrying a huge burden. And when we talked about the way he treats people when they make mistakes or don't do things the way that he thinks they should be done, he was saying, my boss tells me that I'm responsible for 5,000 paychecks, and I take that to mean there's no room for error. And that just will always stick with me. So it's so ironic. He's causing panic attacks and ruining people's lives without realizing that's the impact he's having. And it was all in the name of making sure that everyone got a paycheck. And so that's just a clear example of the types of things that I see when I'm interacting with people engaging in bullying.
I think that's a really good example to showcase the challenges that every human is facing, and that we all are dealing with it differently and not even maybe aware sometimes of what is landing. That's really interesting. Now, I know earlier we were talking about a lot of people don't ever report that there is bullying in the workplace. And so the stat you had shared with me is like 75% of people who feel harassed never report it. I think in healthcare, that's my background, it's 85 witness or experience it, but never say anything. Okay. And fear of retaliation is likely one of the main reasons. But what are your thoughts on this and why that is?
Well, I think organizations don't make it easy to report. And there's lots of nuanced signals that come from leadership or HR or managers that indicate retaliation is a possibility without the organization realizing that they're sending those signals. So for example, if somebody's being overtly sexually harassed, they're less likely to report it if, you know, the VP over there is a crazy bully and everybody knows that he's allowed to act that way or she's allowed to act that way. So by not addressing that other type of behavior, you're letting people know, you know, that it's possible you would be retaliated against. And I would go so far as to say even lower level stuff. So you have a team member who's kind of uncivil and maybe makes sarcastic comments. It doesn't even have to be big bullying behaviors. But if I experience that day in and day out, I'm less likely to report things if I recognize, well, that person's behavior is not being addressed. Why would they address something more serious? So that's one. I think also, or I know people don't know how to step in. You know, people are afraid to step in just because I think there's this thing of like, it's like not so much that if I step in, the organization is definitely going to retaliate. I think it's like if I step in and I say the wrong thing or make it worse, then the organization is going to retaliate. So there's some personal stuff going on. So when organizations are really asking people to speak up, there's a lot of training and communication that comes with that. You can't just ask people to report stuff and then they do it. And then lastly, I'll just say too, in the workplace, we, you know, don't allow vulnerability, right? You're not supposed to cry. It makes you look weak, all of this stuff. There's like a badge of honor if you work when you're sick or work overtime. And so when, you know, people are feeling bullied or harassed or even just treated with incivility, that's a vulnerable place. And it's not in our nature or social norms to charge into HR and say, I'm vulnerable. Will you help me?
Yeah, we don't word it that way. We're like, I'm being bullied, right? So it's like that word.
They're not saying that, but that's ultimately what it is, right? Yeah. They're opening up to HR. So there has to be a lot of trust that HR will take responsibility and try to help. But that's the problem, is that HR has to be empowered to help. And I think that's where HR gets that misperception around HR, that just because I told HR and it's not being solved, HR is part of the problem. But I mean, I was that HR person. I went to my boss all the time. This person acts inappropriately. He's causing people to leave. I'd be in there like another person's leaving because of him. Then 6 months later, oh, another person's quitting. Can you please talk to him? And so I was that HR person getting complaints and I wasn't able to fix it. So that's the deal, is HR isn't always armed with the capacity or the resources or the permission to really address the behavior.
And you're right. I do think HR does get a bad reputation because there's an expectation, and maybe a false expectation, that HR is the person that you go to when these things happen. But within the organization, that power, those processes and policies actually don't really give you autonomy to do anything. You just become more of a sounding board, and then you have to get your authority from somebody else to do something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in that position right now with a client. I've been speaking to a woman who feels not fully bullied, but definitely feels like she's being mistreated by a higher up. That higher up has been with the company for a long time. And when I asked this employee about addressing the behavior, you know, well, if you talk to her, she's going to know it was me that said something. And I said, well, is that really a bad thing? Maybe the three of us can get together. And no, if she knows, it's all over for me. So now I've got to go the roundabout way and try to find other ways to help. You know, so yeah, I'm in that position right now. I'm that HR person who's currently not solving it, but it's because I have to work. I have to maneuver the politics. Yeah.
Yeah. Your most direct path has been obscured.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's interesting. So there's a few things that you'd mentioned that I want to circle back to before we get into how people can help prepare for themselves for those conversations. And we're talking about culture and not having the know-how and being vulnerable, those three pieces there. With the culture, so it's been my experience that if it's almost like you have to see the first person go to see how they're going to deal with it. We've got all these great written things and lots of talk and annual training, but the first person needs to step in and actually have a conversation when something goes wrong. And it's how they deal with that very first one that really sets the tone for if anybody else is going to come forward.
For sure. Totally agree.
Okay, because I've been in workplaces as well where I have seen so many good people leave because they've been so frustrated, and then
Mhm.
to like come and experience it myself as being another one of those people trying to like make a change and say something, and it's been like turned around on you. And I was warned, right? And I think so many people are warned that if you say something,
Mhm.
you'll look like you're the problem. And so
Mhm.
then it's almost as if this feeds the internal dialogue among colleagues, and then the lateral violence starts to get even worse. Have you noticed that as well?
For sure, for sure. I always talk about the fact that bullying and harassment both are a social phenomenon, and so often, I'm speaking from my HR world that again, HR gets focused on that interpersonal dynamic. Well, this person complained about this person, and so it's about those two people, and maybe there's some witnesses I can interview, but it really is focused on that relationship of the two people.
Mhm.
But that's not accurate. It's not happening in a vacuum. So the witnesses, people love that word, or bystander, those people are actually part of the problem because they're not speaking up. I totally understand why they're not speaking up. I'm not faulting them for it, but in the end, they're reinforcing the behavior.
Mhm.
Certainly managers are reinforcing the behavior if they're not speaking up. The organization's culture may have some risk factors that actually allow this behavior to occur. So for example, in a healthcare environment, you've got the doctors versus the nurses. So there's an us versus them. You have the nurses versus the senior nurses versus the new nurses. That's an us versus them. It's a high stress environment. There's a lot of rules and regulations. These are all risk factors that actually create the opportunity for bullying to thrive. So the organization has to address those risk factors too. So this is all stuff that's all working together, and the narratives start coming, and the stories that are told become a big part of the organization's culture. So there's a lot of moving parts, and it's never just about the person bullying and their target.
Mhm. It sounds like we can have all these pieces in place, but if we don't have a common language about it, if we're not having conversations regularly about it so that we know how is it that we safely bring this forward,
Mhm. Yeah.
I wonder, is that the missing piece in the workplace? Is that we don't actually have a language around it to shape it?
I think there's a couple things. Yes, a lot of organizations have anti-bullying policies. That's kind of a new thing these days. And here in the States, I think in Canada, that there are some provinces that require that, and so on and so forth. So that does bring common language. But then again, the problem is it's like, well, this behavior doesn't meet with that language or this description in our policy. So I don't know how to help you, is kind of where HR lands, if
Mm.
especially if their CEO is not allowing them to really address it in the way it needs to be addressed. Um, Totally forgot what I was going to say next. What
Happens to me too.
was the question? I had another really good
It's about needing to have a common language about talking around it. And I was envisioning more like, what is a safe way to come up to somebody and just say, I didn't like your tone, as opposed to
Yeah.
just coming out and saying that. Do we have a common language that we've talked about? Like, is this a good time to have a conversation? And you would know that this is going to be a difficult conversation. Like, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, and that goes back to the organization really providing the right kind of training. So, for example, when we do allyship training for organizations, we really give very clear tools, like literally, here is a list of things you might say in that moment. Pick
Mhm.
one that feels comfortable to you, or two or three. So yeah, really giving people the language, because again, it's not normal for people to step in and throw themselves in front of a bus. So you have to arm them with the language, and then you have to arm them, or give them the impression that it's going to be okay if you
Mhm.
have a conversation like that.
Mhm.
Another really clear risk factor for me, and this goes back to the common language, is that managers are the key factor here, where managers are not trained on how to step in either. So if I'm a manager and I lead a team of 8 people and I'm in staff meetings with them, and one person's maybe a little sarcastic, or there's a couple people who are in conflict, generally, most of the time organizations aren't training managers how to deal with that little stuff. And so then it escalates, and that's how it starts to infiltrate the culture and become part of the narratives and stories that people tell. Well, I was fighting with Tammy and the manager didn't do anything. And oh, he or she knew that we were in a big fight. They saw us yell at each other, but they didn't do anything. So from a very basic level, just building relationships, those managers, just building relationships, and building rapport and that trust. But that's all, again, that's all stuff that managers aren't necessarily trained on. So in doing that, managers could create some common language, at least for their teams.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be a big culture overhaul. A manager could say, in my team, this is what's acceptable and not acceptable. If you're in conflict, you're going to figure out how to resolve it. I'm here to help as a resource. I want you to have conversations if somebody hurts your feelings or there's a microaggression. You should talk about it, and I support you in doing that. So that's a super key to better organization.
I love how you painted the manager's role there, because I think so many people run to the manager just like they would run to HR. And I'm not wanting to take away anybody's what they think is their next best option, but that's who they go to share their pain and then wait for them to fix the problem, which kind of creates another dynamic in the relationship where the trust is broken now between multiple people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So let's come back now to how can targets prepare to file a complaint with their manager or HR should they be at that stage?
Yeah, great question. So a couple things. First of all, document all along the way. So it's possible in many cases, most cases, that you don't have any actual documentation. Like, maybe you have some emails that were written kind of nasty and you can print those out, but you may not have a lot of other sort of proof, right? So the first place is to start is to really document it for a good 2 or 3 months. And so what I'm saying is you have a journal. I would write it. Don't put it on your company laptop, right? Write it out. Who was there? What was the context? What happened? What was said? What did you do? And the key here is to keep that documentation very focused on the facts and not emotions. So see a therapist or have a different journal for your emotions. This is meant to be something that could potentially be provided in court, for example. So you have to see it that way. So that's step number one. It's going to be hard for HR to push you down if you've got 2 months of actual instances where this behavior happened. So that counts as documentation. Secondly, and a lot of people out there in my world may disagree with this, but from an HR perspective, I think it's super important. HR is really going to need to hear that you tried to solve it on your own. So I know there are lots of people out there who have said, I did try to approach this person and it made it worse. So it's like, do this at your own risk. But you want to be able to go to HR and say, here's what's happening. And I tried X, Y, and Z, and that didn't help. And that's why I'm in your office looking for help, because I've tried to solve it myself, versus this person's acting this way and I haven't done anything, because that's going to be the question. And I think that's some of where sometimes HR might feel like, well, the target's the squeaky wheel. Then you come across as helpless. And I'm sorry to say it, but you have to demonstrate that you are the proactive problem solver. Third, you have to think about what you want from HR. So you have to go to HR with a plan, with an ask, right? It could be, I'm going to use a week of leave just to figure out where to go from here. It could be that you need HR to step in and talk to that person. You really have to think about what is it that you want and are willing to kind of negotiate for. And then lastly, I do encourage you to really do some thinking about just kind of like, what's going to happen if I don't get what I need? What are my choices? What choices am I willing to make? So understand that you may not get what you need. And so to really think through that, if they tell me to kick rocks, then I've got my next step and I'm okay with that. So those are kind of the 4 main things to do.
Yeah, from my own personal experience and a lot of people I talk with, what they want often is, I want them fired. I want an apology. I want, all these things that typically, aside from firing, you can't force somebody to apologize. You can't,
Yeah.
make those behavior changes for somebody. So that's really a good point, to be clear on what you want and make it reasonable. I would think, like, what it would be a reasonable expectation where somebody could come in and guide you through this process.
Yeah, I mean, really what we want is for it to stop, right? And I think if it just stopped, maybe you'd feel like, well, I should have gotten an apology, but I think you'd be okay without that apology if the behavior just stopped. And that's what we need. So that's a reasonable ask. I just need this behavior to stop. I
Mhm.
need to feel that when I'm in a staff meeting, I'm not going to be targeted. I need the behavior to stop. And it's interesting too. A lot of times, like the Society for Human Resources Management or the chambers of commerce out there in the world, they really fight against laws about workplace bullying because they say it's going to open up, more litigation. And, we're always telling those folks, it's not that people want to sue, that people don't want to sue. They just want it to stop. And if it
Mhm.
doesn't, then that's when they sue. So
Yeah. So there's an indicator. If you have a lot of lawsuits in your company, you may want to think about doing something.
yeah, I always talk about like have some sort of anonymous tip line, or there's lots of software out there where you can submit a complaint about something, and those HR people who go, we would never do that. We'd be inundated with complaints. Like, okay, then you are a great candidate to have
Yeah.
something like that
Yeah.
in place.
All right. I'm going to try and remember my two thoughts here, because I too can sometimes get so wrapped up in the conversation. It sounds like when you come to HR, not only do you have your evidence, which is very fact-based, which is great, but your solution also kind of needs to be almost fact-based, like not an emotional request. I mean,
Yes.
yes, the emotions are part of it, but if you come in with a legitimate plan that's achievable, we call them SMART goals in nursing. I don't know if you use that there as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but to come in with that already thought out, like I've always said, the path of least resistance. So if you come up with the solution for them, they're going to be like, that's great, let's roll with it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that makes it easier to deal with. So, and then the last thing to keep in mind is, again, HR could take all that in and even be thinking, I know, I've seen it too, or I've experienced it too. But if their CEO isn't interested in solving this problem, then they're stuck. And so I think a good question to ask your HR is kind of like, what are the next steps? Does this all feel reasonable? And just kind of, and then a good HR person would stay on top of following up with you to let them know what they've done with your complaint and what happened if they needed to ask the CEO for permission to solve it. But the problem is, because people who engage in bullying are so focused on competence, that's why they're valued. They are so competent that they've climbed the ladder and they live in this world of just, I have to be the best person at my job there ever was. And so that's where the C-suite gets caught on, well, they're doing all this great stuff. And trust me, I've spoken to many HR people who have tried to make a business case. Yes, they're all this value, but look at all this damage. And often, as I said earlier, it's not until the CEO has been slapped in the face that they're willing. I've actually coached two people who have caused a panic attack in someone. I've coached someone who was all over Glassdoor. I've coached a couple people where it was like a public declaration of the way this person treats others in a blog or a newspaper or something like that. So unfortunately, unless the CEO is savvy enough to understand that relationships are important in a workplace, it's hard for HR.
So I have a question. This actually came up in another conversation. We're talking about the role of HR, ironically, and the role of an internal HR versus an external HR. So what are your thoughts around this? Because, as a supervisor, if I had my employees, we would have the same HR person as our go-to person for all policies and procedures related to HR. So I would come to you and I'd say, I've got this problem with this employee. I'm not sure what are my next steps. We go through the process. I start to interact. The employee now comes to you as well. And they're like, I have this problem with the supervisor. So is there like a double jeopardy here for you? Or like, how does an HR person deal with that and remain objective with both people?
That's a good question. I think, it's HR's role to solve those kinds of problems. So ideally, HR's got to, walk the straight and narrow and really avoid choosing sides. HR, operates a little like legal counsel in some ways in an organization because they're focused on compliance and policies. And so it's important for them to, be aware of how they feel. Like if I don't enjoy interacting with you, Tammy, and someone comes to me as an internal HR or an internal employee and says, Tammy's treating me this way and that way, of course, it's easier for me to go, oh yeah, I don't like Tammy either. But so HR really does have to stay objective. But a lot of times HR will bring in like an external investigator to do the investigation, or a smart HR person recognizes their limits and, may bring in an external HR professional. So, my work is all partnering with HR. So these are departments or HR professionals who have just recognized they're too in it to solve it. And I agree. I don't know if it's internal, external, but I've always said there are two types of HR people out there. There are the compliance ones and the strategic ones. The compliance ones are focused on the rules. The strategic ones are focused on the people. So that actually may be one of your steps as you're thinking about talking to HR. Can you decipher based on your experiences with them what kind of HR person they are? And if they're too compliance focused, maybe it's just better to exit. So a lot of times that comes with careers, like the lower level is the more compliance. And then as you grow into VP of HR kind of a role, you're more likely to be strategic, but not always. And then again, it's up to how does the CEO view HR? Is HR just a cost center who manages people and personnel and benefits? Or does the CEO see HR as an investment where they're investing in a person who can really create the right kind of culture?
That's rich. I love that. Are they an investment? I think that's such a beautiful way to wrap that part up. Yeah, I can see that there would definitely be some challenges in an HR role when it comes to helping people navigate workplace conflict and tensions, bullying, harassment, due to the relationships they build with the supervisors, kind of like as an ally to help them and guide them, but then also then with the employees and finding that balance to walk that. Do they communicate? Do you know your experience? Would an organization communicate when they have an external HR person who's taking the investigation, or do they just, that's not stuff that they typically would share?
No, I think they would share it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The employees, when I'm working with clients, they all know who I am and often reach out to me with their own questions and thoughts. And even they'll ask me, how do I approach the internal HR person with something? So yeah.
Oh, that's good. I think that's such an important piece because often there's, if someone's feeling a little bit too overwhelmed with the situation, there's a lot of distrust and they don't know what's safe.
This is very true, indeed. And, we do climate assessments or employee surveys, and, that you've got to do that with an external person, whether it's Civility Partners or anybody else, because of that. It's hard to know, is this really confidential? Are they going to be able to figure out who I am? And we like to interview employees as well. And I can for sure tell you, people tell me way more stuff than they would tell an internal person.
I am not surprised. If that was me, I would probably spill all the beans too.
Yeah, there's comfort in the stranger who will listen.
Yes, finally. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about the resource that you're sharing with our audience. You talked about a short assessment that helps them highlight these problem areas.
Yes. So I have a great little assessment I think it's 25 questions. That's just kind of, is your culture one that allows bullying to occur? So happy to send that over. Anybody who feels targeted, that's kind of a good place to start. It's just yes or no questions. For example, one of the questions or the statements on there is, do managers have, regular one-on-ones to talk about successes as well as performance issues? And if the answer is no, then that's a risk factor. If the answer is yes, then the organization's on the right track. So it can give you some of that vocabulary that we talked about earlier, vernacular, something to go to HR with. Hey, I noticed we're not doing some of these things. So happy to share that. And then my book, Back Off, has a whole bunch of worksheets in there for preparing to talk to HR, which I'm very proud of that worksheet. So
awesome. Well, we'll make sure we put the links below for sure so everybody can access them easily for those two resources. That's fabulous.
Yeah.
So if I were to summarize our session today, I think one of the main things that you had highlighted was risk factors. Is your organization at risk of having bully claims, bully behaviors, and really understanding what those risk behaviors are, and then having conversations and more than a policy around what we're going to do and how we're going to talk about conflict and bully behaviors in our workspace.
Yes.
And then the last thing I wrote down here was, because people don't know how, we need to create a culture where we can be vulnerable to just start to share this conversation and explore it. Would that kind of summarize some of our key
That's
points
summarized.
today?
Yes, thank you.
Anything else you want to add before we sign off?
I really believe that it's an employer's responsibility to create an environment where people thrive. And I just think that's our moral and ethical responsibility. And it's hard, and it takes a lot of courage and effort and, energy and resources. But people don't join companies for a paycheck. We're so far past that, and that's why people, when they go to HR, they expect something to be fixed. That's the psychological contract they have with their employer. It's never been said, but that's what they expect, that you're going to provide me with a reasonable, decent work environment. And so it's just super important that all leaders and managers out there focus on that. And then on the flip side, being bullied is traumatizing. I mean, my experience was so long ago, and I even say it's kind of bullying light. When all these other stories I've heard, my situation wasn't that bad, and it still bothers me. So I can only imagine what it must be like to go through something worse than I did.
I have to share a little bit about that. We didn't actually talk about how you got into this field.
Yeah, sure. So I was the director of HR, and the workplace was great. The leader was great. It was just this one other director who had been there a long time. He had been there since before the president, and he just, was kind of a micromanager. And if you didn't stay in his little rules and in his lane, he did not like that. He wasn't a fan of change. And I was the director of HR and compliance, actually was my title. So the state laws around the industry we were in were changing a lot. So I was making a lot of change. In hindsight, I should have, brought him in and asked his opinion. But the more I didn't like him and the more I felt that he was aggressive, the more I stayed away from him, of course. And so we got in this spiral. And he, the president was really great in so many ways, but he just would not talk to that person about his behavior. And I started getting my master's degree while I was working there, and ended up doing all of my graduate research on workplace bullying because of my experience, which was very therapeutic for me. But that's all it was. I mean, the guy was a micromanager. He was kind of a punk, not that bad compared to all of the other things that I've heard. And I was depressed. I was there for 5 years, and it destroyed my self-esteem and my ability to be a quality member of the team. Like many, I got myself fired for lack of performance, and I wasn't showing up to work. And when I wasn't really working. And it was just this person had really gotten to me. So, when I think about all of that, it's important that you take care of you. So in the end, if you go to HR and they don't help you pretty quickly, or at the very least follow up to see some sign that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, you got to get out of there before it destroys